Hello and welcome to another podcast edition of Taiwan Talk. I'm Keith Manconi. February 28th is a day of remembrance and reflection in Taiwan. This year, it marks 69 years from what's come to be known as the 228 incident, in which an anti-government uprising was violently suppressed by the Republic of China government. The death toll is believed to lie between 10 and 20,000. But beyond the number of people killed, what's perhaps more difficult to grasp for many of us now so many years later is the human toll that was felt throughout Taiwan society by the survivors. It's this experience, in the decades that followed 228, that novelist Shawna Yang Ryan illustrates in her new book, Green Island, which provides a fictional account of one family swept up in this dark period of Taiwan's history. She joins us now to discuss her work. Shawna Yang Ryan, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So your book opens with the birth of the protagonist. She's born in the very first hours of the uprising that leads to the 228 incident. And then a lot of the rest of the book is also dealing with, I guess, the fallout of that incident. Her father is arrested for giving a pro-democracy speech, and a lot of the book is about the consequences of that arrest. So I think in a lot of ways, the narrative of this book, the narrative of this family, really does reflect the broader narrative of Taiwan and the experience of the aftermath of this massacre. So I want to start by asking, how do you see 228 as a moment in Taiwan's history, and what were you interested in looking at in terms of that history in this book?
Right. Well, in talking to people, it seemed that the way that they talk about that moment is in 1945 being so glad to be leaving Japanese colonialism, to be freed of Japanese colonialism, and to be eagerly looking forward to the arrival of the ROC. And this is how people described it to me. And so when the ROC arrived and the Taiwanese found themselves second-class citizens, they were like deeply disappointed. And then 228 more than compounded that. So in that way, it was a pivotal moment in that they realized the Taiwanese realized that the optimism they had for the future wasn't to be, and that they were yet again second-class citizens. And that's why I think it's such an important moment in terms of thinking about Taiwanese identity.
And that dimension of identity that you're talking about right there, I think for a lot of us, especially those of us that were born far away in time, or for those of us that did not grow up in Taiwan at all, that's an especially difficult thing for us to get a handle on. So was that something that you were really interested in exploring as you were developing this work?
I don't think I expected to explore it when I first began. I thought I was just writing historical fiction, but it turned out to be incredibly important as I started learning more and sort of tracing the story through the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and all the way up to 2003, just tracking historical changes. I ended up tracking changes in conceptions about Taiwanese identity too, just because that came along with it.
Right, and this book does really look at a very large chunk of history. It tracks the lives of this family all the way up into the last decade or so. So it really is a big chunk of history that you're dealing with here.
Right. Thinking about the book and thinking about writing it, one of the reasons I chose to go beyond the 228 massacre is that I thought there was so much attention focused on that one moment, and people were really caught up in sort of like the horror of it, and it was really, really horrible. But people kind of, I think, got bogged down in the details. Maybe not bogged down is the right word, but going over the event over and over again, when really it just had, like you said, so many repercussions that went on for generations in terms of the children, the partners left behind, and the lives they had to pick up, and then just what it did to Taiwanese society after that. So, really, the event was much larger than what happened that February and March in 1947.
Exactly. And, kind of going back to a point I was making a second ago, this probably is a piece of history that most people who know about Taiwan are fairly familiar with. You're going to come across the 228 incident, but doing this in a novel really does put that human experience front and center, and at least for me, makes it accessible and more comprehensible in a way that you don't quite get in a history treatments of this.
Right. Yeah. And I did want to think about that human experience, because it's easy for it to become a list of facts or numbers, or even the story of the night of February 27th with the widow selling cigarettes and what happened with her to set off the protests. That becomes a story that people recite in the same way. And I found that in my interviews too, when I asked people about 228, they would start with that story, and they almost all told it in exactly the same way. And I really had to push them to talk about what it meant to them personally, what it meant to their family, like the actual lived experience of it versus the received experience. And so, of course, that's what I wanted to concentrate on in my novel, was the lived experience, what it was actually like beyond what we can read in a history book.
Yeah, you're kind of hinting at another one of the really interesting things about this book is that it is the product of quite a bit of research that you conducted. Of course, it's a novel, but you did extensive research, interviewing the families that were either directly impacted by the massacre itself or lived through the years that followed, and you really got to know the facts of this history. So can you talk a little bit about that research that you did and how that influenced the writing of the final product?
Yeah, so I came as a Fulbright in 2002, and I had proposed to write this book, and luckily they accepted my proposal. And I actually came into it not really knowing what I was doing. I had just finished graduate school. I had this idea for the book. I knew something about 228, but not a lot. And I thought I could just come in and churn out this draft in like a year or whatever. But I soon learned that there was just so much to have to know in order to understand 228. I mean, to contextualize it, to know about Japanese colonialism and to know about everything that happened after 228. So that took a lot of research. And I learned a lot of that from talking to people. I started with the network that I had. My mother is from Taiwan, so I had some relatives and friends in Taiwan. And so I asked them if there was anybody who would talk to me, and then worked my way out from there. And then I think for a novelist, the sensory details are so important. So spending those years in Taiwan were extremely important too, in terms of creating the world of the book.
Now, sticking with this topic of how you approached all this, you yourself, you grew up in California, so you are definitely well positioned to engage with an English-speaking audience in a way that somebody from Taiwan wouldn't necessarily be able to do. And when we think about the broader English-speaking audience, outside of the very small group of people that have lived here, Taiwanese history, realistically speaking, is not a well understood thing for most people. So, as you approach this, was that almost, I guess, mission of education, helping that broader audience understand Taiwanese history or get more familiar with Taiwanese history? Was that something that you were conscious of as you were approaching this project?
Right. I had really two audiences in mind. One was that generation of Taiwanese, and the Taiwanese Americans I had met who had come over as graduate students in the 1960s. And so they had been like the children of the generation that had been directly affected by 228. And so I wanted to write this book for them so that they would have this novel they would look at and see their story in. But I also wanted to write it for a Western audience that didn't know much about Taiwan, because I think it's important to know about Taiwan. Taiwan has such an important role globally. And I mean, to be honest, a lot of Americans that I encounter can't distinguish it from Thailand. So
that's kind of the joke over here.
Yeah. Well, it's been my honest experience multiple times. So if I could clear that up, I think that would be great.
Yeah. Well, baby steps. Right. And so just thinking about one of those audiences that you're talking about right there, the Taiwanese audience, when bringing this book to that audience, it brings up a whole different set of challenges. Of course, in Taiwan. This is a very difficult period in history to look at, because as soon as you start talking about the 228 massacre, it immediately becomes politicized. I mean, most of the time, that's the case. Whether it's serving the political narrative of this group or going against the political narrative of that group, it's very easy for the work to be seen as more than just a novel, for it to be used by a political group. So is that something that you were thinking about as you wrote this?
I didn't think about how it would be used politically, but I certainly knew that it's a very politicized subject. But I think I try to be fair. When you center it in characters, though, and you make it about the characters, I think that helps eliminate some of the ways that it could be used as a political tool, because it's really about these people, right? And how this history is manifested in their lives. Yeah, I mean, my own family has sort of been a little bit skeptical about it. My family in Taiwan, to be honest, and wondering why I am this foreigner who's come in and written this book. But I think that too puts me in a special position, because if I had written this as Taiwanese, I think it's more likely that I could get sort of caught up in what you're talking about. But I'm coming at it from essentially an outsider's point of view, and I think also that made it a little bit easier for people to talk to me, because they just saw this like sort of harmless and somewhat dumb, like American woman just asking these questions. And they would tell me these amazing things because I think they didn't take me seriously all the time. I just tried to build the story around real characters. And I hope that will it'll make it more of an experience, and rather than, I don't know, propaganda or something like that.
Well, it's certainly a difficult line to walk, but your empathy for the characters in this book certainly comes through, even for the mainland characters, not necessarily just for the victims in this story, but for all the characters. It certainly comes across that you're interested in understanding their experience and the complexity of that experience.
Right. I mean, it's so nuanced, and I think that's what gets lost when stories sort of become calcified into these historical versions that are taken as the official version, right? Is that you lose all these nuances, and individuals are not purely good or evil, and they have complicated motivations. And I think to just sort of get it, that was really important, including from the mainlander side.
So the name that you gave to your book is Green Island, and I think most of our listeners will know Green Island is, of course, the island that's just a little bit east of Taidong in southern Taiwan. Also, for a number of years, was home to a political prison. So why was that the name that you chose for this book?
Well, I went through a lot of different names. I like that it has multiple possible meanings. That it's the prison, but also you can kind of think of Taiwan as Green Island, and I also really love that song Green Island Serenade, and the implications of that song, the multiple meanings that song has. So I feel like that title.
And it's a Taiwanese folk song?
I don't know if it's a folk song, but more like it's a sort of a mid-century pop song, a love song. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it has multiple meanings that I think are encompassed in the book.
Mm. In the sense that Taiwan is also, Green Island, are often referred to as a green island?
Yeah, in that way, but also I think if you want to expand the metaphor a little further, that during the martial law era, Taiwan had become sort of a prison. And that's the era that my characters endure. So thinking about it going that way as well.
Mm. Now, moving this conversation forward to more modern politics, of course, Tsai Ing-wen, one of her campaign promises was truth and reconciliation for her administration, which is set to take office in just a couple of months. And when we talk about truth and reconciliation, of course, that does mean looking at some of these more difficult periods in Taiwan's history that your book deals with. And so just based on the conversations that you had with Taiwanese people in the course of putting together this book, do you see that kind of honest reflection, that kind of dialogue? Do you see that happening in the coming months and years?
I hope so. I think that would be really useful for a lot of people to have that aired out. I think the people who want to deny or resist the story of 228, are maybe contending with this fear of being blamed, but then there are people on the other side who it would be really useful for them to have it acknowledged and more things like that exposed so they can move on. I mean, there was that beautiful article in the New York Times recently about the letters that had not been sent, and then the families had finally received them, and it was just heartbreaking. I think it was the daughter talking about if her mother had just received this letter from her father, it would have been, but it would have enabled her to maybe move on with her life a little bit more than she was able to.
And also looking at the very long reach of this history, a lot of times when we think about these very traumatic episodes in history, we usually think of them as losing impact over the course of time. Memory fades, wounds heal. But I think one of the implications of your book is that the path that Taiwan was on was really shifted because of this incident. And so the trajectory has been very different than it would have been if this hadn't happened for all these years. So in some ways, the impact of that incident just gets compounded as the years go by.
Right. Well, that was interesting to me because when I began doing my interviews and coming from a place of relative ignorance, I was surprised to hear people speak really, I wouldn't say glowing terms, but to speak without a lot of malice about the Japanese colonial period for the people I spoke to who remembered it. And I realized it was sort of in the context, of course, of what happened afterwards of 228 and the White Terror, that suddenly colonialism wasn't looking as bad as it had. And so I think that was a part of sort of the evolution of Taiwanese identity, rethinking that and just reading what has been written about it by scholars and in the newspapers and stuff. It's just amazing the way this identity has transformed and sort of become a national identity too. I think more recently that it's encompassing multiple ethnicities to become more than just like an ethnic identity.
Right, and we certainly see that reflected in polling numbers when people are asked how they identify. Taiwanese is becoming more and more predominant as the years go by. And so you're saying that, the history here really has contributed and is still contributing to that shift.
Yeah, I think all of that history contributes to that. I mean, I think that's something I say in my book is that what brings people together is the shared history. I mean, you can try to indoctrinate people with a sort of patriotism or with an enforced history like the ROC did with the children in schools, or with an enforced language. But I think what really brings people together is a shared experience.
All right. Well, the book is Green Island. It is out now, recently released. Shawna Yang Ryan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to another podcast edition of Taiwan Talk, a show that brings you new interviews from and about Taiwan each and every week. You can, of course, catch the broadcast version of this show Mondays at 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. during the top-of-the-hour newscasts. Or for the podcast version, which you just heard, you can find that in a couple of places. First and foremost, on the ICRT website. You can find it there, on iTunes, or we're just getting into SoundCloud, so you can find it there as well. If you are listening through iTunes or SoundCloud, please do take a second to leave a comment. Lets us know what you're thinking, and also helps other people discover the program, so we do very much thank you for that. That is it for the show today. Thank you for listening. For ICRT and Taiwan Talk, I'm Keith Menconi. See you next time.